Welcome back to another episode of Rowing on the Square. Today is Lessons from the Bow. I was recently asked to go out and row in a boat full of people that I don't know. It was for a benefit slash fair that was happening in town. They wanted to row the boat through the town, kind of hyping everyone up on what's going on and the new rowing club. So, I haven't gone out in a sweet boat like that in a while, and as I was participating, I realized there are a lot of things that I don't realize as a coach that happens to your rowers when you do things like put a bunch of people who don't know each other together. The first thing that I noticed is we started off with the pick drill and we were working with the stern fore. It was really good because I could take the opportunity because I was sitting in the bow seat. So I could take the opportunity to look up ahead at, our stroke people, our stern fore, and get a feel for how they were moving through the stroke. You could definitely tell that all of us had different backgrounds, different techniques. Some people hadn't rowed in years, some people had been rowing on a pretty competitive level. So there was a lot of different approaches to how people were putting the stroke together. And as a coach, that made me think, if I put it together a boat of people who are brand new together, what is the most effective way to get the boat moving together and thinking as one? Because that's really the goal. We started out with that pick drill, stern fore, bow fore. We did a little bit by pairs, and then we started rowing by sixes and by eights. And I felt, as the bow person, I felt rushed into the situation a little bit. I felt that we may not have had as much time as I would have liked in order to feel really comfortable once we started rowing all eight. And I think that that was really helpful for me as a coach because I know that I've gotten out there before with a large group of people that haven't rowed together. And as a coach, sometimes you feel this duty, especially when you're putting a boat together that may not be together ever again. You just want to make sure that everyone in the boat gets some good amount of rowing time in. Everybody feels like they've really accomplished something. And you've reviewed maybe some drills, maybe you've gotten people to understand the way that you break down the stroke as a coach. But I think that, taking a step back on that, I would spend more time rowing by pairs, rowing by fours. I don't even know if I should row by sixes anymore when I have a brand new group of people. And what this reminds me of is I had done a ride along with a coach out in Buffalo, and her team was just an amazing team. And it was like the beginning of spring. They hadn't had much water time yet, and they were just rowing by pairs, rowing by fours. They were doing what they call catch camp, which was basically like the push pull drill, sit at the finish, going up to 3/4 slide, making sure that the blade is squared already, placing it at that 3/4 slide, pushing all the way up to the catch, driving to the finish, and then checking the boat and repeat. They would do this ad nauseum. They would go over it and over it and over it. And what I found was what this allowed this crew to do was that her rowers had a very, very solid picture of what happens from recovery to catch and placement. Her crew understood where the water was in reference to where the blade was on the recovery, because carrying the handle too high, you would hit the water because you're squaring up very early. And but at 3/4 slide, you need to be placed, so there needs to be this action of a gentle unweighting of that blade and knowing where the water is so that it can be placed and pushed and then driven full. So her athletes then would know what a full blade felt like in comparison to a empty blade, which is that rode in blade that has kind of like the light heavy feel to it. It's like light heavy rather than heavy, and like that connection between the foot and then the drive. So I think that, slowing it down and taking the time so that, especially in large boats, when you're rowing eights, that's a lot of people to try to coordinate. So getting everybody to understand where they're supposed to be in the stroke. I think the other thing that is potentially helpful when you're putting together a boat that may not necessarily be a boat that you're going to race eventually, but you want them to get through practice, pause drills are a great place to start there. So a pause at the finish, making sure everybody is extracting and then feathering, a pause at, arms away. How quickly as a crew are you going to bring the arms from the release to arms away? Is a lot of crews love a pause at the finish, that gather at the finish. I have a whole theory on the gather at the finish. I really believe that it's a great technique if you're using it properly. In my mind, when I think of the gather is this moment where you have a light pause in the motion at the finish where everyone is ending at the same point. And then as you come up on the recovery, your recovery pace is greater than that. Like, so the way that the seat is sliding on the recovery is greater than it would be if you were rowing at that lower rate. So at an 18, the pause is significant because you can take a little bit of extra time. The seat is going to move faster than it would if you didn't pause, because if you didn't pause, the seat would gradually kind of move where the wheels would slowly turn up to the catch, which is what I tend to prefer. But the gather does work for some teams. I think there's a bias towards teams that have speed. And the reason I say that the bias is towards those teams that the gather works for these teams that have speed, because I like to see that the seat is moving in unison with how fast the water is passing the boat. So if you have a super powerful team that is getting a lot of force generated, getting a lot of like glide from the boat on the recovery, and the boat is moving fast, meaning that the water is moving fast past the boat, you can allow that time to move the seat quickly. You don't have to kind of take your time as you're coming up on that recovery. You have the leeway that you're not upsetting the balance of the boat by coming out of the finish, because at that pause, you're stopping and then you're coming out of the finish with a little bit of movement, with a little bit of pace. And I prefer to see that from a very strong boat, a boat that is able to move the boat through the water. You can take that pause and get on the recovery without disrupting the movement of the boat. The problem happens with the gather is that people don't gradually get rid of their gather as they go faster, because the gather should be non-existent by the time you get up to top speed. Meaning that the purpose of the gather was to teach you how to continue the movement quickly on the recovery when you were practicing at lower speeds. So when you get to higher speeds, it really is just a continuous motion. You're not continuing to add time at the finish and just continuing to speed up the seat. I think that teams that are faster can use the gather to their advantage so that they can practice the pacing of a recovery at speed at lower paces. If your team is not necessarily the strongest of teams, then the gather potentially could be creating an issue as far as the recovery. It could be encouraging your team to really rush out of that recovery rather than to take the wheels and turn them and turn the wheels at a pace that the water is going by the boat, so that the seat and the boat are moving together, so gliding together, so that you're not disrupting the flow of the boat as you get up to the catch. Because if you're sending your momentum into the stern of the boat, what you're going to do is create this huge deceleration as you get up to the front end. So that's that dipping of the stern every stroke. And that dipping of the stern sends the stern back towards the start line. So we don't want to do that. So I'm not against the gather. I'm for the gather for the right set of crews. But back to the idea of putting mismatched boats together and how to get them to row together. The idea that you need to slow down, you need to do those drills that help with everyone knowing where their body needs to be. Because I really feel that that's the biggest issue that happens in a boat that's full of people who don't row together. Whether that's that someone's working with slower hands than the stroke person may be demonstrating to the rest of the boat. People can feel dragged along, especially on drills if you're not being particular. I'm very particular about my pause drills, that I always tell my crew to be easy off the seat, meaning that when you come off the pause, you're easy on the seat. meaning you're not going to rush right out of that pause and go to the next thing. The biggest place that I see that this becomes a problem is if you're doing like a half slide or a 3/4 slide pause. If it's not clear to your crew what half slide means, half slide to me always means 90-degree angle of the knee. So when your knees get to 90 degrees, that's your half slide. If you're doing a 3/4 slide pause, it's slightly more than 90 degrees, but not full catch. And when my biggest pet peeve is when people come off of that 3/4 slide, pause, and put the blade in the water. I'm like, no, 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 no. If it's 3/4 and you got a quarter of the slide to use, you need to do a quarter slide movement and the blade is being placed at that point. You want to make sure that we're not perpetuating things that we don't want to see in the boat by doing some of these drills. I understand that a lot of teams do kind of round robin, whoever sits in stroke goes to bow and then everybody kind of moves up as they work through maybe that first week of practice. So as a coach in my mind, I think to myself, trying to create comfort for all of these athletes, trying to give them opportunities to learn skills. How do I follow someone I don't know how to follow? What cues am I looking for? What can I say as a coach that could help cue this particular athlete so that they could feel like they're gaining momentum, feel like they're seeing what the other person is doing and moving with them? Even taking some time before going out there in the random boat and sitting next to each other on the erg and just doing arms, body, legs, legs, body, arms, just so everybody in the boat could look over at the erg at the stroke person and say, oh, that's what they've got lots of body angle, or they've got lots of layback, or they sit up really tall at the finish. If I lay back, I'm going to feel off timing. And I think that there's sometimes those things we don't express them to each other. And so we have a stroke person who doesn't have to follow anybody, should be doing their own thing. And everybody else has to conform to this person. But have we given the crew the time to learn how this person moves through the stroke and that they can adapt and try to move in generally the same pacing and position? So those are some lessons that I learned from being in the bow. It was super fun. I had a great time. And the time restriction on the particular crew that I went out with, we went out for about an hour, and it was an hour total, like between getting the boat in the water, rowing out a little bit to the village, turning around and rowing back. It was about an hour. And at the end, it was fun to do some power tens and kind of, run the engine a little bit. And I think as coaches, we try to get to that point. So we're like, oh, it looks like it's moving okay. How about you guys try all 8? And so this is a cautionary tale of maybe just row the 6s, alternate people in and out, give them the opportunity to feel what the boat is doing, learn what the person in front of them is doing so that they can really kind of meld together by the end of the practice. Happy rowing, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.